Welcome to the Pop Culture Diary. This is your go-to spot for trends, gossip, and throwbacks. I'm your host, Paige, and each week we're flipping through the pages of pop culture history. We'll talk about everything from neon-soaked 80s nights to the wild early days of the 2000s and beyond. You can expect the fashions, the music, the movies, the biggest news headlines, the scandals, and basically everything that had us talking, laughing, and obsessing. So grab some snacks, get cozy, and let's rewind the pages of time. Hey friends! The last time we left off was in front of the television, but beyond those cozy living room scenes, 1984 had sizzling, hot headlines. I'm talking about the kind that sold tabloids faster than Diet Coke and shoulder pads. Idols fell from grace, secrets spilled, and rumors circulated that were never proven to be true or false. Beauty queens, rock stars, pop provocateurs, and Hollywood royalty in 1984 had a front row seat to fame's messiest moments. So buckle in, because there's so much gossip it had to be an episode unto itself. The cameras are flashing, the gossip columns are buzzing with one story after another, and no one's PR team can save them now. This is Celebrity Gossip and Scandals of 1984. Vanessa Williams was riding high in '84. She had just made history for being the very first Black woman crowned Miss America. It was a long-awaited breakthrough. In a sky packed with glass ceilings, she shattered one of them. But almost exactly 10 months into her reign, something brutal happened, and it changed her life forever. Let's go back 2 years. It's 1982, and Vanessa Williams is 19 years old. She's a talented young woman attending Syracuse University and working a summer job as a receptionist/assistant at a small modeling agency in New York. A photographer there named Tom Chappelle offers her something: to take nude photos of her. But there's a catch, or rather a promise. He assures her that the photos will be shot only in silhouette, meaning other people wouldn't be able to recognize her. Her identity would be protected, and the images would stay private. Vanessa didn't want to be reckless. She was trusting and maybe even naive. Though she was hesitant, she agrees because she believes she's making an artistic choice, invisible to the world beyond that little studio. Vanessa believes in boundaries and in the promise that the photos will never leave the photographer's darkroom. Fast forward to July of 1984. Vanessa, now Miss America, is only weeks away from finishing her term. Then it happens. Penthouse magazine announces they've bought those photos from Tom Chappelle, and they will publish them. There was no warning or consent. The scandal breaks when Penthouse's September 1984 issue carries the photo under a provocative cover line: Miss America, oh God, she's nude. Suddenly, the private becomes public. Trust is broken, and Vanessa is forced to figure a way out of a whirlwind of betrayal, humiliation, and worldwide attention. The Miss America organization is one that holds its image to notions of purity, grace, and decorum, and they tell her, quote, "You have 72 hours to resign your title." And she did. On July 23, 1984, she becomes the first Miss America ever to give up her crown. Suzette Charles, her first runner-up, assumes the title for the final weeks of that reign. The consequences were deeper than losing a title. Vanessa dealt with shame, judgment, threats, and betrayal. She was only 21. The scrutiny was suffocating. The media painted this situation as a racy scandal, not as if Vanessa was a victim of broken promises and that there was a non-consensual release of nude photos. Vanessa maintains that she never signed a release that allowed the publication of the photos. She believed nobody would be able to identify her. Tom Chappelle, the photographer, did say that she had signed a model release for at least some sessions, but she explained the difference between what she thought was private and what Penthouse published. Penthouse bought the photos and printed them despite her objections. She sued them all, filing a $500 million lawsuit against the photographer and Penthouse's publisher, Bob Guccione. But she dropped that lawsuit about a year later, saying she wanted to move on. Vanessa Williams later described this period as one of colossal pressure. Quote, tremendous shame, judgment, onus. Every move she made was scrutinized. She began to see the emotional cost of how those who voted for her and who believed in her looked at her. On top of the fact that people who had not known her before now used the scandal against her. She recalls death threats, FBI involvement for security, pictures of her hometown sign being taken down, and verbal harassment from cars driving by her childhood home. Here's the thing, though. Vanessa did not let this horrible moment in time define her forever. She has risen through music, acting, Broadway, and television. She has Grammy nominations along with Emmy and Tony nods. In 2015, over 30 years later, the Miss America organization publicly apologized to her, acknowledging how poorly the situation was handled. That apology was also met with a standing ovation. Vanessa Williams' story becomes that of someone who has the ability to bounce back, the kind that teaches us a lot about consent, betrayal, image, and strength. And that was the Vanessa Williams scandal, a story of trust betrayed, public humiliation, but also a major flame that could not be snuffed out. April 1st, 1984 was a day of tragedy in pop music history. Marvin Gaye, the Prince of Motown, was just hours away from turning 45. Instead, he lost his life. Not on stage or in a car crash, but at home, at the hands of the person who gave him life. Marvin Gaye was not just a singer. He was a musical revolution and Motown's shining star. He had smooth hits like How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, Let's Get It On, What's Going On, and just recently, Sexual Healing. Fans around the world adored his voice, his emotion, and his message. However, behind the music, there were dark times. He had depression, drug addiction, financial trouble, and ongoing clashes with his family, especially his father, Marvin Gaye Sr. The wounds from childhood had never fully healed. Marvin Sr. was a strict, sometimes abusive preacher. Marvin Jr. carried scars that were emotional, psychological, and relational. By late 1983, Marvin had moved back into his parents' home in Los Angeles. He was seeking some stability. He was also haunted by paranoia, fear, and self-doubt. He reportedly gave his father a pistol for protection, ironically. Family strife over everyday things had escalated. There were arguments about money, insurance policy letters, about respect, recognition, and control. The morning of April Fool's Day was no joke. Around 12:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Marvin Sr. was in a disagreement with his wife, Marvin Jr.'s mother, Alberta. It was about an insurance policy letter. Marvin Jr. intervened, telling his father to leave his mother alone. Then, voices escalated. Marvin Sr. went upstairs towards Marvin Jr.'s bedroom. Marvin Jr. was dressed in a maroon robe and demanded his father not come in. He warned him, but the shouting continued. According to accounts by Alberta and others, Marvin Jr. then kicked or shoved his dad, trying to physically stop him from coming into his room. The confrontation became physical. At about 12:38 p.m., Marvin Sr. returned with a .38 caliber revolver. It's a gun that, as many reports note, Marvin Jr. had earlier given to his dad for protection. He pointed the gun, and without much warning, he fired the first shot, hitting Marvin Gaye in the chest. The bullet pierced vital organs like his heart, lung, and others. By many accounts, the first shot was fatal. He then shot again, but this time it was closer, at point-blank range. Marvin slid to the floor as his mother screamed. His brother, Frankie, who lived next door, dashed in. Marvin was rushed to California Hospital Medical Center and arrived around 1 o'clock, then pronounced dead at 1:01 p.m., only 23 minutes shy of his 45th birthday. Shock swept through the music world. Fans could not believe it. Motown legends, peers, and friends were stunned. Marvin Sr. was arrested and originally charged with first-degree murder, but this changed because of a medical diagnosis. He was found to have a benign brain tumor, and when it came to his psychiatric evaluations, his understanding and judgment were called into question. By September of 1984, Marvin Sr. pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. He was given a 6-year suspended sentence and 5 years probation. He was never imprisoned. Some accounts suggest that Marvin Gaye's final words were, quote, "I got what I wanted. I couldn't do it myself, so I made him do it." Whether or not this was spoken clearly, it still haunts the story. There's a man in pain, a relationship in pieces, and perhaps even an attempt to accept his own demise. His mother, Alberta, and his brother, Frankie, were by his side. The grief that night must have been so heavy and unimaginable. There was probably rage, guilt, sorrow, and love tangled all together. Marvin Gaye left behind music that still moves us, music that is socially conscious, romantic, spiritual, and unrestrained. His song, What's Going On, changed the language of patriotism. Sexual healing reminded us of vulnerability, need, and intimacy. His death made the world really think deeper about many things, such as mental health in Black artists, generational trauma, what fame demands, and what silence can hide. The day after his death, memorials and tributes poured in. Thousands mourned, and songs were even written in his honor. Marvin's ashes were later scattered in the Pacific Ocean. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., lived until 1998. He died of pneumonia, still carrying the heaviness of what happened. Some in the family have publicly suggested that Marvin knew what he was doing, that he provoked his father as a way of ending his suffering and punishing his father at the same time. Marvin talked about his depression before. On his internal struggles, depression, and feeling unloved, Marvin Gaye once said, quote, "I was a manic depressive. I was at my lowest ebb. I really didn't feel like I was loved." It was also reported 4 days before his death that Marvin's sister said he attempted suicide by jumping out of a moving car. That's Marvin Gaye's final heartbreaking chapter. A story of music, family, success, and sorrow. The kind of story that reminds us that some of the loudest songs do begin with silent suffering. On December 8th, 1984, it was one of those nights where partying and fame met tragedy, and nothing would ever be the same. It was the middle of Hanoi Rock's first American tour. They were a band from Finland finally getting attention stateside. They were hanging out with Motley Crue in Redondo Beach, California. The night was long and the drinks were flowing. People were laughing, smoking, making music, and just living the rock and roll lifestyle we think we know. At a certain point, everyone noticed something missing. There was no more booze. So, Vince Neil, lead singer of Motley Crue, offered to make a quick liquor store run. Nicholas Razzle Dingley, the drummer for Hanoi Rocks, went with Neil. Both men had been drinking heavily. Neil was driving his bright red 1972 De Tomaso Pantera. According to later reports, neither he nor Razzle was wearing a seatbelt. The car was fast, the road was wet, and the night, as it often does under heavy drinking, had grown reckless. They turned onto a curve, trying to swerve around a stationary fire truck. Their speed was estimated at 65 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour zone. The car lost control on the wet pavement. It fishtailed and skidded. Then came the collision. Vince's car crashed into an oncoming vehicle. The impact was violent. Razzle was in the passenger side. Glass shattered everywhere, and bodily force met head and desk. The drunk driving, the speed, the alcohol, and the design all collided. Razzle was pronounced dead at the hospital just hours later. The two people in the other vehicle were seriously injured. Brain damage, broken bones, and lives changed forever. Vince Neil was lucky to have survived with cracked ribs and facial cuts. Vince was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence and vehicular manslaughter. His blood alcohol content was 0.17. That was on the edge of twice the legal limit in California at the time, which was 0.10. In September of 1985, the legal verdict arrived. 30 days in jail, 5 years probation, $2.6 million in restitution to the victims, and 200 hours of community service. But due to good behavior and maybe other factors, Neil served roughly 15 to 20 days of those 30 in actual jail time. The death of Razzle hit the rock community so hard. Hanoi Rocks never recovered fully. Their style, their energy, it was all abruptly altered. They dedicated their friendship, their grief, and later their music to the memory of Razzle. Michael Monroe, the band's frontman, often described Razzle as the heart and soul of their group. someone who lifted moods and paid attention to others, even during any turmoil or chaos. Neil, for his part, had personal guilt and physical wounds. In later interviews and his autobiographies, he describes the crash as something that haunted him because of the grief, the regret, and seeing lives changed permanently. Some bandmates and others in the scene have said that Neil never fully apologized in the way that many felt was necessary, and that tension fractured friendships. Death tends to test loyalty. It's September 14th, 1984, and the first ever MTV Video Music Awards happened at Radio City Music Hall in New York City. A brand new event meant to celebrate the future of music television. But nobody in that glitzy crowd of rock stars, producers, and industry execs had any idea that by the end of the night, a rising singer named Madonna would change the very definition of a live performance and outrage half the country in the process. Madonna was 26 years old, fresh off her debut album's success, and ready to debut her new single, Like a Virgin. The concept? Simple and utterly scandalous. The curtain rises to show her on top of a giant wedding cake, dressed in a white lace wedding gown, complete with a boy toy belt buckle, veil, and thigh-high stockings. She steps down slowly, microphone in hand, and is surrounded by dancers dressed as tuxedoed grooms. It looked innocent enough until it didn't. When her stiletto heel caught on her veil, she stumbled, and in a moment that was not choreographed, she dropped to her knees, rolling onto her back, legs splayed in an awkward angle, skirt hiked up, and began to roll around on the stage while crooning Like a Virgin, touched for the very first time. That one unscripted move, a total accident, became the moment. The crowd gasped. Some laughed nervously and others clapped, confused but captivated. And television audiences at home, most were shocked, offended, and taken aback. The next morning, America was only talking about Madonna's performance. Newspapers called it obscene. Talk shows asked, has music gone too far? Parents were furious. Religious groups even denounced it as blasphemous. MTV execs fielded complaints from viewers who called it, quote, softcore porn on live TV. But teenage fans, they were obsessed. In a single night, Madonna became a household name. The backlash only fueled her legend. The press could not stop talking about her, and she couldn't stop giving them something to talk about. She once said later, quote, I didn't know what I was doing that night would cause that kind of reaction, but once it did, I knew I had power. That performance was not just a performance. It was the birth of the Madonna myth. The lace gloves, crucifixes, layered necklaces, messy curls, and bold sexuality became the blueprint for her entire persona. She blurred the line between innocence and provocation, religion and rebellion, and culture could not look away. In 1984, mainstream America was not used to a woman openly controlling her image, her sexuality, and her own story. The fact that she could scandalize men, priests, and TV anchors alike and smile through it made her both villain and hero, depending on who you asked. MTV got exactly what it wanted. Ratings, controversy, and headlines. Madonna got something even bigger: control. The Like a Virgin moment marked the start of an era where shock became strategy and not chaos. She would go on to master reinvention, performance art, and controversy as tools of creative control. Every future MTV performance that tried to shock, like Britney's snake dance or Miley's twerking, owes a debt to that night in 1984. Even decades later, people still debate whether it was art, rebellion, or accidental genius. But there's no denying that that stumble, that roll, and that smirk, it rewired pop culture's understanding of what a woman could do on stage. That night, Madonna detonated a bomb, and as the smoke cleared, America realized something it wasn't ready to admit yet: that the pop princess was not asking for permission. She was seizing the crown. A year earlier, in 1983, Britain was already a pressure cooker. Margaret Thatcher was still in power, the Cold War hummed in the background, and everyone was bracing for nuclear anything. The last thing anyone expected to ignite the culture war wasn't a bomb, it was a song. Enter Frankie Goes to Hollywood, 5 working-class Liverpoolians with a taste for leather, innuendo, and synths so sharp they could cut glass. Their debut single, Relax, dropped in October of 1983. It's a hypnotic dance track built around a beat that didn't just invite you to move, it dared you not to. But beneath that slick production was a lyrical time bomb. Quote, "Relax, don't do it when you want to come." End quote. Yeah, that come. On the surface, it was club-ready pop. Between the lines, it was unapologetically queer, sexual, and, for the BBC, entirely unacceptable. By January of 1984, Relax had started climbing the charts. Then, in one of British broadcasting's most infamous on-air meltdowns, BBC Radio 1 DJ Mike Reed stopped the recording mid-play. He announced live that he was banning it, calling the lyrics obscene and disgusting. Within hours, the BBC officially banned Relax from both radio and TV, including the wildly popular Top of the Pops. You would think that would have killed the song, but instead it exploded. Sales tripled within a week. Club DJs spun it on repeat, and teenagers raced to buy it just to see what the fuss was about. By February, Relax hit number 1 on the UK singles chart, staying there for 5 solid weeks, despite not being allowed anywhere near the airwaves. Moral panic has always been the best PR strategy that no one admits to using. Of course, British tabloids did not miss a beat. Headlines screamed about filth on the airwaves. Paparazzi stalked the band, especially frontman Holly Johnson and drummer Peter Gill, whose flamboyant style and openly gay imagery made conservative Britain twitch. The group's videos, especially the infamous Relax video, featured leather harnesses, steam, and a homoerotic nightclub scene straight out of Soho's underground. MTV would not touch it. In the UK, Channel 4 briefly aired it late at night, then yanked it after angry letters started to pour in. For the tabloids, that was jet fuel. Headlines like "Pornographic Poppers," "Disgusting Disco." One paper even accused the band of corrupting youth through rhythm. That might be the most British insult of all time. Frankie Goes to Hollywood didn't flinch, though. They doubled down, showing up in TV interviews wearing shirts that read, "Frankie says relax." What started as a rebellious slogan turned into one of the most iconic fashion statements of the decade. Soon, everyone from punks to yuppies was wearing one, including kids who had no idea the shirt slogan was technically about orgasm control. Their follow-up single, Two Tribes, kept the controversy burning. This time, they mixed Cold War paranoia with Ronald Reagan impersonators beating each other up in the music video. The band's mix of satire, politics, and overt sexuality made them both hated and historic. By the end of 1984, Frankie Goes to Hollywood had become the first act since Jerry and the Peacemakers to have their first 3 singles reach #1 in the UK. What made Relax more than a scandal was what it represented. It was queer, it was bold, and it didn't apologize. At a time when Britain still treated homosexuality like a dirty secret, the song forced it into mainstream conversation, blasting from radios, wedding receptions, and teen bedrooms across the country. And even though the BBC tried to bury it, Relax became a victory lap for expression itself. The leather, the smirk, the synths, that was all part of a message that you could be taboo and triumphant at the same time. Nothing says you've won like being banned by the BBC and topping their charts in the same week. In the end, Frankie Goes to Hollywood didn't just scandalize Britain, but they taught it a lesson in irony too. The louder you try to silence a song, the louder it echoes through history. 1984, millions of Americans are glued to their living room sets every afternoon, hypnotized by the flashing lights, the jingles, and the smiling hosts of network game shows. One of those shows is Press Your Luck, a brand new CBS game that debuted in '83. The concept is simple. Contestants hit a buzzer to stop a whirling light on a massive game board filled with cash prizes and exotic trips. But there's a catch. If the light lands on a grinning little red cartoon devil called a whammy, the contestant loses everything. The higher the stakes, the bigger the temptation. And in 1984, one man outsmarted the system, turning America's favorite game show into his personal ATM. His name was Michael Larson, a 35-year-old ice cream truck driver from Ohio. On paper, he looked like an ordinary guy, but Larson wasn't interested in luck. He was obsessed with patterns. He spent his nights glued to the television, recording episodes of Press Your Luck on his VCR, a relatively new luxury at the time. He replayed them in slow motion, pausing frame by frame, and what he noticed would change game show history. The supposedly random flashing lights on the game board? Well, they weren't random at all. Larson realized that the board actually used 5 repeating patterns. If you memorized where the prizes were, you could predict exactly where to stop the light and never land on a whammy. This wasn't luck. It was digital detective work. Michael Larson flew to LA, auditioned for the show, and shockingly passed through as just another eager contestant. Producers thought he was quirky but harmless. He told them that he wanted to win enough money to buy a house. Nobody knew he was about to hack the show live on national TV. On May 19th, Larson took his spot at the podium under the blazing studio lights. He looked nervous, but not because of the cameras. He was waiting for his patterns. When the game started, he hit his buzzer with uncanny precision. Each spin, each pause was exact, like a computer executing code. He never hit a whammy, not once. At first, everyone in the studio thought he was just lucky. Then they started to realize something was off. Larson hit $1,250 plus a spin over and over. Every time he landed on a plus a spin, he got another turn, and he just kept going. The audience went from cheering to stunned silence to nervous laughter. The producers started sweating. The host, Peter Tomarken, tried to keep it light, but was visibly flustered. Larson was demolishing their game. Minutes turned into an hour. The taping ran so long, the show had to split it into 2 episodes. By the end of his run, Larson had racked up $110,237, the equivalent of over $330,000 today, all from memorizing patterns. CBS executives were furious. They thought Larson had hacked the system, cheated, something. But when they reviewed the tapes, there was nothing illegal. He hadn't broken any rules. He just exploited a flaw the show didn't know it had. It was technically genius. Larson's win was the single biggest one-day haul in game show history at that time, but his story didn't end in celebration. After his Pressure Luck appearance aired, Larson became a minor celebrity for about 5 minutes, but greed got the better of him. He invested his winnings in what he thought was a sure thing, a radio station prize contest that promised to double his money. It was a scam. He lost almost everything. Then, in a bizarre twist of poetic justice, he stored what little cash he had left, about $50,000, in single-dollar bills hidden in his house. When he left home one winter day, his house was burglarized. The thieves took everything. By the 1990s, Larson was reportedly caught up in get-rich-quick schemes and later investigated for fraud. He fled Ohio before authorities could press charges and eventually died of throat cancer in 1999, alone and nearly penniless. To this day, Michael Larson's run on Pressure Luck is legendary, both for his brilliance and his downfall. He didn't just beat a game, he exposed its vulnerability. He made the TV industry rethink how it handled randomness, how it tested contestants, and how easily a clever mind could outwit a $1 million production. And, in a strange cinematic twist, CBS didn't erase him. They eventually aired his entire game in full as a, quote, TV legend. Because in the end, Larson wasn't a villain. He was a product of the 80s. It was a time when technology, greed, and ambition came together in neon-lit glory. Michael Larson may have pressed his luck harder than anyone before or since, but in the end, it was his own luck that finally ran out. In 1984, while pop stars were dancing on MTV and kids were begging for Cabbage Patch Kids, a very different drama was playing out behind closed doors. One involving mobsters, politicians, and the most powerful labor union in America. The story centers on one man, Jackie Presser, the flamboyant, cigar-smoking head of the Teamsters Union. He wore expensive suits, rubbed elbows with presidents, and strutted through Washington, D.C. like he owned the place. But behind that polished exterior was a secret that would shake the labor world and expose one of the strangest FBI scandals of the decade. To understand Jackie Presser, you've got to understand the Teamsters. They weren't just any labor union. They were the labor union. Founded in 1903, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters represented America's truck drivers, warehouse workers, and freight handlers, all the muscle that kept the U.S. economy moving. But by the mid-20th century, the Teamsters had become known for their corruption and mob ties. Jimmy Hoffa's name still loomed over the organization, even after his mysterious disappearance in 1975. When Jackie Presser became president in 1983, the feds hoped he'd clean things up. Instead, he brought a whole new layer of intrigue. Here's where it gets messy and a little unbelievable. Jackie Presser wasn't just the president of the Teamsters. He was also a paid FBI informant. That's right. While leading one of the most powerful unions in America, one with deep connections to organized crime, Presser was secretly feeding information to the federal government. The FBI saw him as a valuable source. He provided intel on mob infiltration in unions, political deals, and corruption schemes. In return, they quietly looked the other way on some of his own questionable dealings. It was a dangerous game. Presser was both the hunter and the hunted. In 1984, federal investigators started sniffing around a strange operation inside the local Cleveland Teamsters that Presser once ran. They discovered, quote, ghost employees. Those are fake workers who were being paid salaries for jobs that didn't exist. The scheme was simple but lucrative. Union funds were being siphoned off to pay these phantom employees, some of whom were connected to organized crime. It was a classic union corruption straight out of a mob movie. The problem was Jackie Presser's name was all over it. When investigators moved to indict him, the Department of Justice hesitated. Why? Because if they prosecuted Presser, they risked exposing his double life as an FBI informant. That would mean revealing that the federal government knew about the ghost employees and had done nothing to stop it. By the summer of 1984, the situation had turned into a political powder keg. Here was the head of one of America's largest unions, accused of embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yet the Justice Department and FBI could not agree on what to do with him. If they indicted Presser, they'd expose their own complicity. If they protected him, they'd look like they were shielding corruption at the top. In the end, they did what institutions often do when caught between two bad choices. They stalled. The indictment was delayed for years as the government quietly debated how to manage the fallout. Meanwhile, Presser kept climbing in influence. He was re-elected Teamsters president and even had the ear of President Ronald Reagan, who saw him as a key labor ally in the 1984 re-election campaign. Imagine that, a man under investigation for mob-linked corruption shaking hands in the Oval Office. Secrets don't stay buried forever. By late 1984, reporters began hearing whispers about Presser's double life. The Cleveland Plain Dealer and other outlets started digging into his connections, piecing together the story of a union boss who might have been playing both sides, the mob and the feds. Leaked details painted Presser as untouchable, a man who could outmaneuver prosecutors, manipulate politicians, and keep everyone guessing whose side he was really on. Behind closed doors, the Justice Department was in full panic mode. They knew that if the truth came out that the FBI had knowingly allowed a corrupt informant to stay in power, it would be a scandal of national proportions. And they were right. Eventually, in 1986, after 2 years of political infighting and leaked memos, Jackie Presser was formally indicted on embezzlement and fraud charges for the ghost employee scheme. But by the end, the damage was done. The public had already learned that he'd been on the FBI payroll. Congress held hearings. The media called it, quote, one of the most embarrassing episodes in FBI history. The Teamsters' reputation, that was already scarred from the Hoffa years, took another beating. Presser denied everything, insisting he was being framed by political enemies and mob rivals. Before his case could go to trial, he was diagnosed with brain cancer and died in 1988, taking many of his secrets with him. Jackie Presser's story is the kind that feels ripped from a political thriller, but it really happened. He was a man caught between two worlds, the mob and the government, loyalty and survival. And in the gray area between justice and corruption, he found a way to live like a king, for a while. His downfall marked the end of an era for the Teamsters, forcing real reform and federal oversight that would last well into the 1990s. But maybe the strangest part of all this is, in the eyes of the FBI, Jackie Presser was both the problem and the solution. In the 1980s, scandals were not confined to Hollywood or the tabloids. They were hiding in boardrooms, union halls, and the corridors of power. And sometimes the most dangerous double agents were not spies at all. They were just men who knew too much. In 1984, the world could not get enough of the Jacksons. Michael was the king of pop. Thriller was still dominating every chart, and the family name had become its own kind of dynasty. But while all eyes were glued to Michael's moonwalk, there was another Jackson quietly writing her own story. Her name? Janet, and by the mid-1980s, she was done playing supporting character in her own life. Janet Jackson had spent most of her young life performing, literally. She joined Good Times as Penny when she was just 10 years old, went on to Different Strokes, and even appeared on Fame. But even with those credits, she was still living under the immense shadow of her brothers, especially Michael. By 1982, at only 16, she had released her debut album, Janet Jackson, followed by Dream Street in 1984. It was a bright bubblegum pop project filled with big synths and hopeful hooks. It was glossy, optimistic, and very much shaped by her family's control, especially that of her father and manager, Joe Jackson, whose influence loomed large over every Jackson child. But behind the perfect smiles and choreographed appearances, Janet's personal life was starting to make headlines of its own. Rumors started flying that Janet had secretly married James DeBarge, a member of the R&B family group DeBarge, who were known for hits like All This Love and Time Will Reveal. They were young, beautiful, and both from musical families. To fans, it sounded like a fairy tale. To Joe Jackson, it sounded like a nightmare. Janet was just 18, and Joe was furious at the thought of losing control, both over her career and her image. The couple's elopement reportedly happened in September of '84 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They kept it quiet, even from her family at first. But the press caught wind of it quickly, and once they did, the rumors exploded. Some magazines claimed Joe tried to have the marriage annulled immediately. Others reported that Janet had run away from home. There were whispers of late-night arguments and speculation about James's drug problems. It was something Janet herself would later confirm had deeply affected their short marriage. It was messy, romantic, and tabloid gold. The media dubbed it a pop dynasty disaster, the kind of story that sold magazines by the truckload. Once the marriage rumor broke, Janet couldn't escape it. Every interview, every red carpet, she was no longer the rising Jackson sister, but the runaway bride. The press started painting her as the rebellious Jackson, the one going against the family brand of perfection. Teen magazines printed breathless updates about whether she had left DeBarge. Black entertainment outlets, which had championed her acting and her singing career, expressed concern that the relationship could derail her momentum. Even People and Ebony ran pieces about Janet's new independence and the secret marriage she couldn't hide. 1984 was the dawn of celebrity obsession, when entertainment news was becoming its own empire, and Janet Jackson, barely out of her teens, was learning what it felt like to be under that relentless microscope. The truth, however, was far sadder than the tabloids knew. Behind the rumors and the romanticized headlines, Janet's marriage to James DeBarge was unraveling almost as quickly as it began. DeBarge was struggling with substance abuse, and Janet, who had grown up in a household that ran like a military operation, suddenly found herself in chaos. She would later describe feeling isolated and overwhelmed, saying in interviews years later that she had been trying to save him, but couldn't. By the end of 1984, just a few months after the marriage, Janet quietly left James and returned to her family. The official annulment came the next year in 1985. But the fallout was huge. The press didn't know the details, so they filled the blanks with speculation. There were whispers about a secret baby, a rumor that would haunt Janet for decades. There were also claims that her career was over before it began. Meanwhile, Dream Street dropped that same year, in October, and while it wasn't a chart-topping success, it was a signpost. Janet's sound was evolving. She was experimenting with a funkier, more confident edge that would soon explode on Control in 1986. But back in '84, critics were not convinced yet. Some called her cute but unoriginal. Others said she was still under her father's thumb. They couldn't see what was coming. That Janet Jackson, freshly wounded from heartbreak and family control, was about to turn into one of the most powerful pop artists of her generation. Janet Jackson was still searching for herself that year, and the press was not making it easy. She'd been labeled the good girl turned rebel, a narrative that tabloids adored. Every move she made was dissected, compared to Michael, or contrasted with her brother's public struggles. But quietly, Janet was learning, watching, and planning. By the end of 1984, she had started to realize that if she did not take control of her own story, someone else always would. So, maybe the year 1984 wasn't the one that made Janet a superstar, but it is the one that forged her. Behind the headlines about secret marriages, family feuds, and rumors that wouldn't die, there was a young woman building the armor she would need for the next phase of her life. Because when Control dropped 2 years later, the message was super clear. She wasn't anyone's little sister, anyone's project, or anyone's scandal. She was Janet, and she had finally taken her name back. Some rumors start with a grain of truth. Others start with a gerbil. 1984 gave us Ghostbusters, the Macintosh, and the dawn of tabloid obsession, when celebrity gossip stopped being whispers and started becoming national headlines. In the middle of that circus stood Richard Gere, Hollywood's brooding heartthrob, the man who'd made American Gigolo a cultural event. But that same sex symbol image, dark, mysterious, sensual, was about to make him the target of one of the strangest, most persistent urban legends in pop culture history. By 84, Richard Gere was not just famous, he was fantasy material. He had already starred in American Gigolo in 1980 and An Officer and a Gentleman in 1982. Both cemented his place as the ultimate brooding romantic lead. Audiences swooned and critics raved. Richard Gere's appeal was equal parts dangerous and intimate, the kind of magnetism that made gossip columnists foam at the mouth. And back then, the line between celebrity news and urban legend was paper thin. Sometime around 1984, whispers began to go around in Hollywood, on college campuses, and even in hospital staff rooms. The claim was that Richard Gere had been admitted to an emergency room after an incident involving a small rodent. The story varied depending on who told it. Some said it was a hamster. Others said it was a gerbil. In every version, the tone was gleeful, salacious, and cruel. There was never any evidence, no police report, no hospital record, and no witness. But that didn't matter. This was the 80s, when rumors didn't need receipts, just punchlines. It spread by fax machines, tabloid hotlines, and the ultimate gossip carrier, word of mouth. The urban legend took on a life of its own, circulating so fast that it reached international notoriety long before the internet ever existed. So, why did this one catch fire? First, there was Richard's on-screen persona, which was seductive, enigmatic, and a little too perfect. To gossip-hungry audiences, he was the kind of man you couldn't quite figure out. And in the 80s, a decade both obsessed with sex and terrified of it all at once, people projected their own curiosities, fears, and stereotypes onto stars like him. There was also a darker undercurrent, the homophobia that ran rampant through the tabloids. Many urban legends of the era used shock rumors to target male celebrities with androgynous beauty or rumored queerness, often implying they had, quote, unusual sexual habits. Richard Gere, who had been an icon of erotic cinema, became an easy mark for that toxic cocktail of fascination and judgment. It wasn't really about the gerbil. It was about the culture. It was a culture that sexualized its stars, then mocked them for it. By 1984, celebrity tabloids were thriving. The National Enquirer and Star were selling millions of copies a week. TV gossip shows like Entertainment Tonight had just launched, and viewers were hooked on every scandal. But this rumor was so bizarre, so scandalous, that even the tabloids didn't want to touch it directly. Instead, they kind of danced around it. They would publish vague blind items like, quote, a leading man's hospital visit raises eyebrows in Tinseltown. It became an open secret. Everyone knew the rumor, but no one officially printed it, which only made it feel more forbidden. And that's exactly how urban legends thrive. Before long late-night comedians were making winks about it, college kids told it like it was a fact. And poor Richard Gere, who never said a word publicly about it, was stuck with it for decades. The rumor followed him everywhere. Even as he moved on to massive hits like Pretty Woman in 1990 and Primal Fear in 96, jokes about the gerbils surfaced on talk shows and stand-up routines and later in the early internet message boards of the 1990s. He became the poster child for celebrity urban myths, and what made it worse, he was notoriously private. He never played along, never laughed it off, and that only made people gossip more. But you can't really blame him. Imagine living your life, building a serious career, starring in award-winning films, and still having people ask you about something that probably never happened. It was a modern parable of fame. Once the story spreads, truth becomes irrelevant. By the time the rumor reached its peak in the mid-'80s, it wasn't just about Richard Gere anymore. It was about us. Our obsession with tearing down the beautiful, the powerful, the untouchable, our need to turn private people into public fantasies, then public punchlines. In a way, the Gere rumor foreshadowed the internet age perfectly. It showed how fast lies could move, how impossible they were to contain, and how they could define a person forever, even without a shred of proof. The truth is, Richard Gere never commented, never confirmed, and never denied. And that silence, that refusal to play the game, might have been the smartest move of all. Because in a decade obsessed with exposure, maybe silence was the only way to survive. So was it ever true? Of course not. But in 1984, truth was optional and gossip was gospel. In 1984, Lionel Richie was unstoppable. Every radio station, every wedding, every slow dance, there he was. His voice was warm velvet, and his lyrics were love letters. He'd gone from the Commodore's frontman to solo superstar, writing the soundtrack to a decade that adored him. However, even the man who wrote Endless Love was not immune to a little chaos. While Lionel was topping the charts, he was also starring in a real-life love triangle that made tabloid editors sing. In 1984, Lionel Richie was everywhere. His solo debut in '82 gave us Truly, You Are, and My Love. Then came Can't Slow Down. It was the album that defined his career. Selling over 20 million copies, it gave us All Night Long, Running with the Night, and Hello. He was beloved by everyone, from moms, teenagers, critics, and even MTV, which couldn't get enough of his cinematic videos. But while he was serenading the world with devotion and fidelity, his own love life was far more complicated. Lionel had married his college sweetheart, Brenda Harvey, in 1975. They met at Tuskegee University and built a life together long before superstardom. Brenda wasn't just a wife, though. She was part of the business. She managed aspects of Lionel's career, and the two seemed like a power couple who had weathered fame gracefully. Until whispers began that Lionel had been spending a lot of time with a woman named Diane Alexander. Diane was a model and dancer who had appeared in Lionel's 1986 Dancing on the Ceiling music video. But by most accounts, the two had crossed paths earlier in the mid-'80s when Lionel's solo career was. Rumors swirled that their chemistry wasn't just professional. Gossip rags began hinting that Lionel, the man who wrote Say You, Say Me, might have been saying it to someone other than his wife. And though Lionel tried to keep his private life private, Los Angeles was not a forgiving town. By 1984, word was out that something was going on and that Brenda knew. In the 80s, the National Enquirer and People magazine could make or break a star. And what's better for them than the clean-cut king of love songs caught in a messy love triangle? Reporters started printing veiled references to marital troubles and a glamorous mystery woman. It was the perfect recipe for obsession. You had a faithful image, a public marriage, and a whisper of betrayal. Even though the alleged affair was not publicly confirmed, everyone was talking. Fans, journalists, even late-night hosts. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was Lionel Richie, the man who made millions cry over songs about loyalty and devotion, suddenly cast as the cheater in a soap opera of his own making. By the mid-'80s, Lionel and Brenda were living separate lives. He was often seen with Diane, but they kept their relationship as quiet as possible. For years, Lionel tried to maintain both his public image and his private balance, but it all came crashing down in 1988 when Brenda discovered Lionel and Diane together at Diane's Beverly Hills apartment. According to reports, Brenda allegedly confronted them, and the encounter turned explosive. Police were called, and Brenda was arrested for trespassing, vandalism, and spousal battery. The scandal hit the headlines like a freaking grenade. For the first time, Lionel Richie's perfect image had cracks, and everyone could see them. Lionel and Brenda's marriage officially ended in divorce in 1993. 2 years later, Lionel married Diane Alexander. They had 2 children together, Miles and Sophia, before divorcing in 2004. In later interviews, Lionel reflected on how fame, pressure, and the constant touring life strained his relationships. He admitted that living under the microscope of global success made it impossible to separate the man from the myth. It's worth remembering, behind the polished persona was just a man trying to navigate love, loyalty, and the madness of fame. But the irony of this whole saga, even as his personal life unraveled, Lionel Richie kept writing some of the most romantic songs of his era. When fans sang along to Stuck on You or Say You, Say Me, they weren't thinking about scandal. They were thinking about love. And that's what made Lionel so enduring. His music rose above the gossip, and it outlasted the headlines. In the end, people didn't remember the triangle. They remembered the voice. Lionel Richie was proof that even the gentlest hearts can end up in messy love stories, especially when the world is watching. Okay, we're only halfway through this neon fever dream. Coming up in the next episodes, we'll dig into the toys and games that made parents lose their minds in toy aisles, the music that rewrote the charts, the tech and gadgets that were quietly helping to create the future, and the fashion and trends that showed what it meant to live and dress in 1984. That's it for today's trip through the Pop Culture Diary. Thanks for tuning in and taking a trip back in time for a hit of nostalgia with me. Don't forget to follow the podcast wherever you get your shows, rate, review, and keep an eye out for the podcast on social media over on Instagram at the Pop Culture Diary Podcast, Twitter at Pop Cult Diary Pod, Tumblr at the Pop Culture Diary Podcast, and the Facebook page, The Pop Culture Diary, for more pop culture fun, extras, and behind-the-scenes madness. Until next time, everyone take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next episode.